In part 2 of my interview with the respected economist Dr. K.S. Jomo, we talk about the impact of the China-US trade spat on Malaysia, our relations with Europe, and the possible rejuvenation of palm oil-based biodiesels. The global issues roiling markets around the world, things like the trade talks that seem to be deteriorating between the Americans and the Chinese, the strong US dollar for another, and also the fact that some emerging market economies like Pakistan, Argentina clearly, as well as Turkey, they seem to be crumbling around the edges. Are you concerned that these issues might tip Malaysia into some kind of, or at least disrupt the reform agenda happening within the country?
When we think about what is happening in the world today, and what the problems between President Trump and China, for example, the pursuit of a trade war and so on, President Trump was known as being a very effective negotiator. Okay,
but he wrote the book on it, right?
Well, somebody else wrote the book,
and he put his name to it.
Yeah, but I think more importantly than that, some people may not be able to express themselves very well, but he has this reputation, or he likes to think of himself as a great negotiator. Allowing for that, the question, when you're negotiating, let us say the two parties negotiating, the requirements of negotiation in such a situation are very different in a multilateralized world. So when you go with your excessive demands, expecting to be, the excessive demands to be lowered, you can do that on a bilateral basis. But once you do it in a multilateral system where there are already norms and standards which have already been established and accepted, then you're going to basically upset things a lot. Now, very, very importantly, the current American administration sees things in bilateral terms. And that
forgetting that there are economic repercussions around the world. So how does it all end for Malaysia? Or at least how does Malaysia navigate this?
I think precisely because we are inconsequential, there's an advantage there. We can export. We are now the single largest exporter of photovoltaic solar panels to the United States. And there's a great deal of room because we are considered inconsequential. And there's some advantages of being inconsequential as such. So I think it's not all gloom and doom. Okay. Now, coming more to the financial issues, if we think about the Argentine situation, what the Argentine situation tells us is that after Macri was elected president, he thought by playing by the rules of Wall Street, by the rules of Washington, his problems would go away. Instead, they are now worse than ever. Okay. So so what lesson do you draw from that? Or what lesson do we draw from Turkey, where you have a very complex situation involving, all kinds of things, other things as well, in terms of geopolitics, in terms of internal Turkish politics, and so on and so forth. So I think it is very, very difficult to draw conclusions from an admittedly turbulent situation for Malaysia, But your basic concern is quite correct, because if you look at all these crises, the contagion spread throughout the world.
And then it becomes a fear factor, less of a fundamental factor.
Well, that's one way of looking at it, but there are many other issues involved. But contagion is a very complex phenomenon, and
it's psychological in the main, not really driven by
and if people, as many people in this country are driven by, superficial indicators, okay, they are likely to be affected, markets are likely to be moved, and you can easily set in motion a panic, So my advice, and nobody is going to pay much attention, is to actually try to see through the whole situation. But it might not be very helpful. It might not be very helpful for somebody who is short-termist. And unfortunately, we increasingly have a culture of finance which is short-termist. And what we really need in terms of growing the economy, growing the country, is a much, much more longer-term vision in terms of how we look at the world.
Should Malaysia re-pivot back towards the European bloc, because they have kind of been left behind in all this interface with the North Americans and the Americans and the Chinese?
I've been a great fan of the ASEAN commitment to ZOPFAN, peace, freedom and neutrality. And if we take neutrality seriously, it means not a bias towards the Americans, not a bias towards China, not a bias towards the Saudis, not a bias towards Europe, but dealing all with as potential friends and corporate partners in cooperation. And so I would see having stronger relations with Europe. It is difficult now, especially with the vote against palm oil. Exactly. But you know, I think there are huge opportunities with Europe if the Europeans get it right. But if
Malaysia also gets it right, because our international trade minister seems to be very inward-looking, and they seem to be dealing with largely domestic issues.
I think you're maligning the poor man. I mean, he's a new minister. Maybe he has not said very much so far. But how to conclude from that he's only interested in domestic issues?
For now, yeah, should he do more internationally and specifically with the Europeans?
Well, what is our strategy? We have to have a strategy before we start pursuing that strategy.
What do you think the strategy should be?
I certainly don't think that having the CPTPP or CPTPP lookalikes in the form of a US Malaysia or US ASEAN free trade agreement is the way forward. What we need to do is be very clear where development is going to come from, where investments should come from, what kinds of investments we're looking for, what are we going to do with those investments in terms of what we produce. That should be foremost in our minds. You know, how do we create the conditions for sustainable investment and growth, and then on that basis, you know, develop the kinds of relations. I for example, would very much favor trying to, you know, renew the effort which has been neglected for over 3 decades of developing palm oil-based biodiesel. Not only for Malaysia, because Malaysia is now number 3. You know, but internationally, and becoming biodiesel may well be the future in terms of biofuels.